Hey guys, it's Neon. Welcome back to Clownfish TV. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about comic books. I'm going to talk about Marvel comic books and actually a theory I had last year. I'd written an article for a Disney fan blog called The Kingdom Insider about Marvel comics and Disney's plans for Marvel going forward, whether or not Disney would actually consider cutting Marvel comics loose in favor of the movies or outsourcing Marvel comics to other publishers. Now, this particular article was written last August, and it actually is the one that sort of dragged me into the whole Comicsgate scene because I did not realize that any of this stuff was going on. I had worked on comics professionally, mostly on Disney stuff for a variety of publishers. Never worked at Marvel or DC. And honestly, I sort of let comics work slide for a couple of years as I pursued better paying opportunities. So I was very surprised to come back into comics or take a look at the comic scene and look at the sad state of the comic book industry. And then, beyond that, just looking at all of the fighting on the internet and all of the drama going on surrounding professionals and professionals attacking fans, and it's absolute insanity. But this was actually the article that sort of got me started down that road. And I speculated, being that I've written for Disney fan blogs before, being that I actually watch the Walt Disney Company more or less for a living now, and looking at the situation, and I was trying to reconcile like how Marvel's comic book publishing operation fits with the Walt Disney Company's way of doing business, and frankly I couldn't reconcile the two, because Marvel Comics does not work like a traditional Disney owned company. And I have talked to people since then. I have a pretty good idea as to why. This was long before Axel Alonso got fired, etc. But my speculation was that at some point in time, Disney will realize that they don't need to publish comic books anymore. I think this day is actually coming relatively soon. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first one is that obviously the MCU has more or less eclipsed Marvel Comics and brand awareness to the average consumer. Okay, so what's going on here is that Disney, I think, is consciously sort of relegating the comics to the back burner to chase the movies. And people, a lot of people don't realize that actually Marvel Comics and Marvel the MCU Marvel Studios are actually two different companies. Marvel Comics is owned by Marvel Entertainment, which oversees their television productions, the comic books, etc., etc. Marvel Studios, which produces the movies, actually answers directly to the Walt Disney Company. Now, the reason I think that they'll probably cut the comic books loose at some point is that Disney is not in the business of creating material for niche markets, and comic books. The comic book industry in the state that it's in right now is a very niche market. And, Disney just doesn't really go small. They've actually cut successful companies loose before. So in the article, I went into a little bit of the background on the American comic book market. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you kind of know the story here. Obviously Disney purchased Marvel in 2009, and people immediately were like, oh, Disney's going to stop publishing comic books. That didn't happen, but it seems like they're slowly phasing out comics in favor of the movies. As the movies become huge, bigger and bigger and bigger each year, the need for the comic books sort of diminishes. So after that, I kind of went into the comic book industry as I see it today, which is basically being propped up by corporate America. I mean, you've got the two major publishers, Marvel and DC, both are owned by giant corporate entities who at any point in time could just decide that comic books are not worth their time. And I think that's probably going to happen pretty soon. I mean, I'm not saying like within the next year or two, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if either Disney or Time Warner blinked and just said, look, it's not really worth it for us to continue to create magazine-style comic books for a shrinking specialty market. It makes about as much sense as releasing major records as on vinyl, which I know they still do that, but that's more for the collector market. It's not a good overall business strategy. So at some point, either Disney or Time Warner will probably just say, you know what, we've had enough of this. This isn't really all the money that we're paying salaries, we're paying in printing costs. We can easily allocate those resources to other things that actually do generate money, like movies, like television, like digital. So what I was trying to get across to people, what really caused a lot of the comic book professionals to freak out and completely freak out on me, was that I suggested that, this is very important, Disney has a different definition of success than the rest of us, okay? Just because comic books are doing okay, or maybe comic books have a year or two where, you know, the sales increase a little bit, the industry has pretty much flatlined. And, you know, the last year or two, especially, things have really decreased. If you look at Comichron, their estimate for 2017, now these are diamond sales, but the overall North American dollar sales for Diamond's comics, graphic novels, magazines for the year is around $522.25 million, down 10%. That was 2017. I think 2018 is probably going to be down more than 2017 was, just based on what I'm seeing so far. Now, if you compare that, now we're talking, this is the entire direct market. This is like, now this doesn't include graphic novels sold through bookstores. This doesn't include digital, but again, digital sales I do not believe account for very many comic book sales. I've heard it's around 10% of what print sales are. That sounds about right-ish to me. But, okay, so the entire comic book industry, all of the publishers, Marvel, DC, IDW, Boom, Image, they all generated $522 million in 2017. Compare this to the movies. Okay, just Black Panther alone this year in the US has generated $698 million. Okay, that's like a lot more money than the entire comic book industry. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's not, I mean, this is one product generated this much money compared to an entire industry generating this much money. And at some point, most likely Disney, I think probably Disney, because they've got bigger fish to fry, they probably will decide that this really isn't worth it for them, that again, they could take those salaries, all the expense and the freelancers and the printing and all of that, and they could allocate those resources to other things like their streaming services, any kind of mobile app development they're doing, whatever. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that comic books would end. And again, this is another theory that I had, just knowing how Disney operates with their own Disney comics, and now I've worked on Disney comics off and on for about 15 years now, and they always license out their comics. Okay, and the reason they do that is they basically let other companies pay Disney for the honor of publishing their material, which is pretty ingenious because there's zero risk involved for the Walt Disney Company. They put the stuff out there. If it turns a profit, they get some money. They get paid by the licensee. It's win-win. They don't have to hire a bunch of freelancers themselves. They do have people that oversee these projects, and to make sure that everything is good. But they really don't. They don't have to bother themselves with the day-to-day operations. Okay, so my thought process here was, at some point, Disney may decide that it makes more sense to just outsource the Marvel superheroes like they do Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or Uncle Scrooge, and just license those characters to have characters created within the MCU, or maybe continue the continuities created in the comics. I was theorizing last year that it might be IDW, because it seemed like Disney was kind of chumming up to IDW with Big Hero 6 and Star Wars, and sort of testing the waters there. But since IDW has flushed itself down the toilet, I don't think IDW is a very good option for Disney if they ever want to just license their superheroes out to other companies. But here's the thing that's actually kind of scary if you're a comic book collector, a comic book fan. Just knowing where comic books fit in the grand scheme of things to the Walt Disney Company. Okay, Disney really, as I understand it, they don't really care about comic books at all. And I've heard this from multiple sources within the Walt Disney Company, that comic books have about as much value to Disney right now as a t-shirt. Even less value because there are much higher profit margins on t-shirts, and people buy t-shirts. Okay, a lot more people buy Disney t-shirts than buy comic books. So I talked about that, and I did talk about, you know, again, you're not having to do constant damage control on social media with t-shirt artists. Just saying, this is another huge thing, and I think this is a scenario we're kind of looking at right now, where Disney is constantly having to put out forest fires with editors and freelancers saying really stupid stuff on social media. Disney employees are gagged. Okay, they are gagged. They are not allowed to make ridiculous comments on Twitter, ridiculous comments on Facebook. The problem with Marvel is that a lot of their people are freelancers. They don't have to adhere to the same rules that full-time Disney employees do. So you've got all these loose cannons out there, you know, doing all of this damage with the fandom. And again, Disney really can't control all of these people very well. So eventually what happened was they, you know, fired Axel Alonso. I think they kind of started at the top because of the, from what I understand, the PR disaster. You know, there were constantly negative news about Marvel Comics in the mainstream media. It just got to a point where somebody had to answer for that. Somebody had to pay for that. But here's the thing. People keep making the argument that Disney still needs comics to strip mine for ideas. I do not believe Disney needs the comic books at all anymore. I think Disney has decades worth of stories that they can take the best ideas from, and really at this point they can go out and they can hire the best comic book writers to produce ideas for the movies. I mean, Disney could really create superheroes from the ground up that have never existed in the comics, and they've kind of done this to some level in some of the MCU movies, where they've changed the characters so much they don't really resemble themselves in the comics, and they've been successful with it. They could completely just create new superheroes just for the movies, and the general public wouldn't be any the wiser. I mean, they really wouldn't care. It's a Marvel movie. You know, never mind that this character, you know, never existed in the comics. It doesn't really matter at this point. And this is the one thing that everybody needs to be aware of with Marvel, is that Marvel's just a brand of Disney. They can job out comics to smaller companies. I talked about that. Really, at the end of it, this is all that matters to Disney. Like, they do not care about the comic books. They care about the MCU. They care about the theme parks. They care a great deal about the theme parks. The characters, the Marvel characters that are coming to the theme parks, both in Walt Disney World and Disneyland, are not the comic book characters. They are the MCU versions, because in Disney's mind, the MCU is the real Marvel. I get the impression, again, from talking to people, that Marvel Comics just kind of came along for the ride. They really wanted the characters to create movies from, to create theme park attractions from, but they really wanted to take those characters and kind of make their own thing with it. The comic books, you know, Disney is not, again, they are not in the business of catering to niche markets. Disney is like, go big or go home. And at some point, I think they're just going to realize that comic books, you know, really don't serve their overall business plan very well. Here's what I expect to happen eventually. I think Marvel Comics will simply become licensed comics featuring Marvel superheroes. It's just a theory, but I expect Disney to move more and more of its comics properties to outside publishers while pruning its in-house staff. This is already kind of happening. I think Marvel Comics will always remain in some form, but it just might be an office full of brand managers overseeing licensed deals, and not the house of ideas that it is today. And actually, some could argue if it's even a house of ideas, because it seems like they just keep regurgitating the same ideas over and over and over again. You don't see any new characters. Expect Marvel to transition to more digital, more graphic novels, eventually phasing out the floppy monthly comics completely. They just don't make sense financially. And then the fallout from this, and we're already seeing it in the last year or two with multiple comic shops closing. I mean, they're closing at a crazy rate. It's like every week there's a comic shop closing. If Marvel pulls out of publishing comics, it's over. Like, I don't know which comic shops could rebound from losing 30 to 40% of their inventory, unless they at that point have completely turned themselves into a Funko Pop store, which many of them are doing now, or just going to tabletop games. But comics as a medium won't die. Since I wrote this, there have actually been some interesting developments. Of course, the big development here, well, one of the big developments is that a few months after I wrote that, Axel Alonso got gone and CB Cebulski was brought in. Everybody was like, yeah, CB Cebulski. And actually, from what I know of him, he's actually was a pretty decent guy. But here's the thing. I don't think CB Cebulski was brought into Marvel to usher Marvel into a second golden age of comic books. I think CB Cebulski was brought in to transition Marvel's comic book publishing arm into an IP factory, even more so than it is now. CB's background, of course, is working in international markets, creating new characters, creating new brands. And if you look at his original, the original article in the New York Times, one thing that jumped out at me was this bit here, where it talks about his stint as a translator and freelance writer. Of course, we know what happened with that. Mr. Cebulski joined Marvel full-time in 2002, blah, blah. 2011, he became the vice president of international brand management for the company. In his new role, Mr. Cebulski will be responsible for the editorial and creative side of Marvel's publishing division. His duties will include recruiting new talent and helping shape the ongoing sagas of the company's heroes. It is work similar to what Mr. Cebulski was already doing on a global level. Dan Buckley said, blah, blah. Mr. Cebulski negotiated publishing agreements in Japan, China, South Korea, and will establish local characters in their own adventures, but in sync with Marvel's plans. It is important for our growth, Mr. Buckley said. Mr. Cebulski is not a new guy, but he looks at the world differently than a traditional editor. I think what he's probably going to do long term, I think he's here to help transition Marvel Comics into whatever Marvel Comics becomes next. Again, I said if it becomes sort of an office full of brand managers creating IP that they can use for movies, video games, whatever, the actual comic books themselves become less and less important. I actually think this situation might turn out a little bit like Childhood's End. Okay, so I think we're at the end of the direct market. I think that the comic book industry, as we know it, is going to transition into something else. I think that there might be a bit of an uptick, sort of a golden age before the old comic book industry basically dies. And I think Mr. Cebulski might be kind of like Karelin, where you're not exactly sure what he's here for. He is here for the greater good, but the greater good is not necessarily what the fans want. I think the greater good is what the Walt Disney Company wants and where they want to take comics next, or at least the Marvel IP next. And again, it would not surprise me if within 10 years, Marvel Comics was just an office full of brand managers cranking out different superheroes, different concepts to be used in other media, and not actually producing comic books themselves, but rather, if they're still making comics, just jobbing them out. I don't know. This is just an opinion I have based on what I know of Disney and how they tend to run their companies, and Marvel Comics just does not fit with the rest of Disney's plans going forward. Their plans going forward is to focus heavily on digital entertainment, streaming entertainment, movies, video games, television. Comic books to Disney, I think is just it's a very archaic medium. And once it serves its purpose, it would not surprise me if they just jettisoned the whole thing in favor of something else. So, I don't know, guys. That's just my thought on it. Again, I can't substantiate any of this. It's just an observation. But I do think we are absolutely in the final days of the direct market. And, I think we're definitely in the final days of monthly comics. Especially with comic shops closing at an alarming rate. I don't know if any of this can really be turned around, for good. I think that there are going to be some temporary ups, but it seems like the overall trend has just flatlined. I think the comic book industry has flatlined, at least in the direct market. I have a little more hope, I guess, for graphic novels. going forward, but the comic book industry is not in good shape at all. So, and if you're watching this video, you probably already know that. Anyway, I'm going to log off for now. Be curious what your thoughts are. I mean, where do you see comics in 5 or 10 years? Do you think that the direct market is still going to be viable? Do you think we'll still have a healthy number of comic book shops, or do you think that everybody will have gone out of business by then? I'm not feeling too good about it. All right, guys, that is it. This has been Neon for Clownfish TV. I will talk to you later.